let's get started. Welcome to my talk about how to help your users to enter data more efficiently. I'm Jonas, working for Eclipse Source. Before I start the talk, the most important question is, who of you knows about EMF Forms and has heard about it, used it? Okay. Background of this talk is we have talked a lot about EMF Forms at several conferences, and we looked at the submissions that we had in the past, and we actually realized that most of the talks that we have done in the past are quite targeted at beginners. So they are targeted in introducing the framework, explaining the basis, and then typically we end our talk with the sentence, and there's much more which we don't have time to show. Now, what I would like today is continue with that sentence and actually show you what else there is. So this is the first advanced EMF Forms talk we have in EclipseCon. So if you're familiar with EMF Forms, you're at the perfect place. If you don't know EMF Forms, I will give a very short introduction, but I will keep it really brief because today I really want to have time for more advanced features and not disappoint the people who actually know all the basic stuff. Okay, so what is EMF Forms for those who don't know? It's a framework to build form-based UIs efficiently. Those form-based UIs are based on the data model, and the idea is that you don't code your form-based UIs manually, but instead you describe them with a declarative artifact that we call a view model. So at the end you have two artifacts, a data model, in our case typically an eCore in EMF, but it could be also an XSD or UML or whatever. And additionally you have what we call a view model. That's a very simple declarative language describing how the form should look like. And then during runtime those two artifacts are processed by a rendering engine, and then actually you get a fully working form that you can embed in your application. Now, the advantage of this approach, or there are actually two main advantages of this approach. The first, it's much faster than manually coding the UI, and the second, because you're based on the framework, you get a lot of features for free that you would typically need to add yourself, and you need a lot of code to implement those. And those features I would like to demonstrate today. So the remaining part of my talk, I will actually demonstrate 6 features or 6 feature areas altogether, and I will basically just do a live demonstration of those features in the IDE to target those people who already know about all the basic stuff. Maybe you attended my talk yesterday. Yeah, and that's it. So let's go. The first advanced, I want to present the demo setup that I have before I go into the first modification of that. If you know EMF Forms, this might look familiar. I have our common example model with 3 entities, and we will focus as always on one entity, which is an entity called user, and it has a couple of attributes. It doesn't really matter, it's just an example, but this is the data entity I will present in the form. Attributes are, for example, first name, last name, email, and so on. And additionally, I already have a view model for that. That's the artifact which describes the form-based UI. That's over here. And currently the UI looks like this. So I have 2 columns showing all those attributes in 2 groups. Basically the screen resolution is really low here. And we see we have live validation and so on. And in the remaining part of my talk, I will tweak this UI a bit to show you some of the more advanced features. Okay. So let's go back to the slides. Okay, the first feature I would like to present is visibility and enablement rules. That's a very frequently requested features if you get started with EMF Forms. The idea behind that is that very often in forms you have some conditions, and based on those conditions you want to show certain fields or not. So if the user has said A in one field, then you don't want to show field B. If you manually code that, that's really ugly to do because you have dependencies between your different UI controls then. In EMF Forms, you can actually describe those conditions in the view model, and the runtime will automatically resolve those conditions for you. So let's see how that works in practice. So if we look at my form, what I actually would like to do is I would like to put a condition on the field height, and if I select German as a nationality, I will not show this field. There's no background, it's just an example. I have to be careful about this so to not be politically incorrect, but I think there's no connection from height to German. Okay, so what I do is I browse to the control height in my view model, and I attach a show rule to that. This show rule I can now configure to either hide or show this control based on a condition. In my case, I want to hide it. And now, as a sub-element of that, I can add the condition itself. That can be either already a leave condition, or I could potentially combine several conditions to one with or and end. I will take a leave condition to keep it simple. Now, this leave condition typically points to another value in my same form, and for that, I add a domain model reference to my condition. A domain model reference points to another value. So let's do that. And now here I can select that the other value that this condition resolves against is nationality. And now in the leave condition, I can specify the expected value when this condition should resolve to true. And as I already specified the other attribute, it can actually pick up the possible values. So I select German. And now this means if this condition is true, this rule will hide the height field. So let's check whether that works in the preview. Yeah, it works because it's already gone. That was the value, and now if I select French, this is visible again. Now, if you have ever programmed something like this in SWT, it's quite some work. The nice thing is that it doesn't only work on controls only. You can also attach that to container. So let's assume I want to disable the left group completely if I select French in this nationality. So for that, I do exactly the same thing. I add a rule. This time I choose an enablement rule. I select to disable that. I add a leave condition again. To this leave condition, I add a reference. I point this to nationality again. And this time I select French. And by specifying that, I have to refresh this. Now we see that the left group is completely disabled. So I don't have to re-specify that for all contained controls, but just the complete group is disabled. And of course, again, if I select German now, the field is hidden and this is enabled again. So pretty simple, but very powerful. Okay, so let me remove those rules again, because I don't need them for the next part of the demonstration. Okay, and just refresh this. Okay, next thing I would like to talk about is layout. It's actually, if you talk to users of such a tool, layouts really matter. It's very important to have a consistent layout of your controls to help your users to find the right field within your application. So we have developed a lot of different support for layouts, and I would like to show 2 examples today on how you can improve your layouts. So the first thing that I would like to show is, currently I have a very simple layout. I have just 2 groups next to each other. If you develop more complex forms, you sooner or later will reach the point that you cannot place all controls on one page anymore, because it's just too much stuff. Now, for that, EMF Forms supports a layout element that we call category. Category doesn't necessarily imply how this is rendered at the end. I will show you that in a second, but category means that I split my form into several categories, and those are not rendered on the same page anymore. So let's do that. So I add a categorization, and in that I add 2 leaf categories. There are composite categories too, so I could even form a tree of those pages. Let me give them a name first and second, like this. And now I just drag the two groups that are currently on the same page into those categories. And let me remove this left over here. And let's refresh that. And now we see that's the default rendering, that we have two pages now, and I split my form over two pages now. What you can also see is that the validation is aggregated here. So because there are two validation errors on this form, I can actually see that something is wrong here. So users can still see this information even if you split your form over several pages. I was mentioning that this is the default rendering. Of course, if you think about those categories, you could display them differently. This is like a page type layout, but you can also render them as tabs. So let me configure that. And refresh that down here. And now I have exactly the same UI rendered as tabs. That's always this nice thing about those abstract concepts in the view model. So we don't have an element called tab or an element called page. We have an element called category, and you can then render them differently on demand. Whatever you would like, you can exchange the renderer for that. Okay. So let me, I think I can leave it like that. Let me just switch that back to the default for the next part. So the next layout element that I would like to show is more on the right side. As you can currently see, all the controls are in the flat list, and they're above each other. So it's a very simple layout. However, if you want to save space and if you have controls which do not require the full length, you probably sooner or later want a more complex layout. You want to somehow arrange them in a more grid-like thing. And you might have the use case that, for example, in the first line you want to have two controls, in the second line one control spanning the whole space, and then two controls again. Now there is an element in EMF Forms for that called a control grid. So let me do that for this first category. So what I do is I add this control grid. A control grid contains rows then, and in rows I can define cells. This might sound familiar. It's actually a simplified version of a regular SWT grid. However, you don't have to configure all the spans because EMF Forms will actually do that for you. So what I do is I define two cells in my first row, and then let's just copy that again, and in the last row I will only have one cell. Okay, and now I can just drag my controls into that layout. So let's do first name, last name in the same. I have to open that. And then email. Let's make the gender here, and date of birth is the control which requires the most space, like this. And then let's refresh that. And now we see I have a much more concise layout. Important fact is that everything is still aligned. So this is aligned, this is aligned, this is aligned. And while this doesn't sound too important for developers, typically end users really care about that. They like this clear alignment because then everything looks nice and they find the information that they want. Again, if you compare the effort that I've just spent with the manual effort to create such a grid layout in SWT, if you don't do it very often, you might agree with me that this is much more efficient. Okay, so let me switch back, and one thing that I wanted to show that I just forgot, that actually was the first thing that I wanted to show. We extended the group type quite a bit over time, because groups are used very heavily by a lot of users. Like categories, they're really a very generic element. Group just means, okay, those elements belong together, but it doesn't again necessarily mean how exactly you render them. And our standard group renderer now, for example, has a collapsible type. So if I select this and then refresh down here, this is actually collapsible. This was possible before by exchanging the group renderer, but in the meantime, it's in the core frame. Okay, let me switch that back. And actually, what I want to do is I want to remove this one and just add those controls again. By the way, that's another more advanced features. If you would like to add attributes which are not yet on the form, you can use this generate option, and it will show you all the attributes from the data model. You can also use this option up here, which actually browses the current UI and finds all the attributes which are not yet displayed, which is very useful if you evolve your model and have quite a few attributes there, because you can easily find what's missing. So those are the attributes that I would like to add again. And then I save this, and now I have my simple layout again. Okay, now let's go back and talk about input validation. Also very, very important topic for many applications. Idea is to show the users if a value is wrong or malformed, and ideally already prevent users to enter wrong values at all. Now, EMF Forms has support for that, and we already see examples down here. Those fields are actually marked in red, and the reason for that is that those fields are specified to be mandatory in the model. So if we look in the, if we have a look in the data model, that's not the data model. We see that last name and email are marked as mandatory fields. We can actually see that because the lower bound is 1, and also by this small number up here. And that's why they are currently marked in red in the preview. And only if I enter something, then validation is happy again. Now, while this is nice, this is obviously not enough for more complex data types. However, the good news is that EMF allows to specify more complex constraints on your attributes, and that can be done by defining a custom data type. The advantage of doing that in the model rather than in the UI code is that you can reuse these constraints for any purpose. So for example, you could validate your data without the UI, you can validate it in a form, but you can also validate it in a table, for example. So I would definitely avoid to put those validation rules and the constraints themselves close to the UI code, because that will likely lead to code duplication. So how does that work in EMF? I will do an example with the email field, and the email attribute of user is already using a data type in EMF, or in my example model. Now currently this data type is just a string, so it inherits all constraints from string, but it doesn't have any further constraints. So let's change that. You can actually specify those constraints as a regex, for example, and that's what I will do. Because I'm not fluent in regex, I've prepared that. Actually, I'm very bad at writing regular expressions. So let's copy that over, and let's have a look. Let's remove this for a sec. So this is now a pattern which describes a valid email address. I will not go into the discussion whether it's really complete, because there are like millions of blog posts about that. I'm happy with this one. Yes?
If I have many models, maybe with different paths, and I have several email address fields, is there some...
You can reuse the data type. So you would place the data type in the central model, and you can just reuse it.
So it's not a string, it's an email data type.
Yeah, this is email, so it has the name email. Yeah, this is just the type it is based on, because it needs to be based on a primitive type. Okay, so let me regenerate my model to reflect this change, which is part of EMF. And now, if I go back to my form, I can actually observe. Should be able. No, it's not. Sorry, it will not work in the preview because it has to pick the validator up. So what I need to do is I need to launch my example application now. So this example application embeds EMF forms, so it shows exactly the same form but only in a running application. So let me do that. And now you can see even if I enter something, it will not remove the error until yeah, so currently the data binding is set to on focus lost, so that's why it's revalidating when I leave the field. But hopefully, yeah, so now it doesn't validate. And by the way, you can switch that, so there's a switch that it validates on every keystroke. That's up to you, whatever you like. Now, while this is cool, I can now validate the correct email address. It would be even better if the user wasn't even able to enter something wrong. So for example, I can enter illegal characters which cannot be part of an email address. So EMF Forms provides supports to forbid that. The name of this feature is called preset validation, and that basically means EMF Forms attaches a listener to the control, a key listener, and on every keystroke it validates the current string against the data type, and if the key is illegal, it will not even allow the user to enter this. So let me activate this. To activate this, you basically have to add this service to your run configuration. It's called Prevalidation. And let's just relaunch that. And now I cannot enter anything anymore, and the reason for that is that my pattern describes a complete email address. So this is obviously doesn't make too much sense, but to show you that it actually works, what I can do is I can copy a complete email address into this field. That would still work because it's at the same time. Now, how to solve this problem? On purpose, I've selected such an example where the complete constraint doesn't make sense to be validated on every keystroke. And for those purposes, we actually added the possibility to specify what we call a loose pattern. So that's a second pattern which is typically very similar to the first one, but it's less strict. So that defines, okay, that are the values that we want the user allowed to enter, and the real pattern is still validated when the data is actually sent to the model. So let me add a loose pattern here. As you can see, it's less strict. It basically just restricts the characters that you can enter here. So let me move that in here, and then let's regenerate the model to reflect that. And restart the application. And now I can still enter stuff. Now it's very difficult to demonstrate that I cannot enter a legal character because you would just need to believe that. But what I can actually do is I can copy this and paste, and it will not even paste. So it's not possible to enter a legal character. Again, the nice thing about this, it's specified in the model. So if you have another UI showing the same attribute, it will automatically pick up the same constraint. So you have never have to worry about this constraint anymore. While in many applications which have manually coded UIs, this kind of constraints is kind of baked into the UI code. So it's very hard to reuse that. Okay, a final thing. No, I will skip one thing. I will skip one thing in the demonstration, but just to mention that if you don't like, for example, the colors of the validation, or let's say you don't want to show the star over here, or you want a different icon here, there is actually a configuration model in EMF Forms 2. We call that a template model. It's pretty much like CSS for web application, and you can configure all those things in there. So you can select which color to show, which icon to show, whether it should show a star and so on. Okay. Next topic I would like to show is tables. So far we have talked about form-based UIs. EMF Forms provides the same feature set kind of for tables too. So let me demonstrate that. For tables, I will use another view model because it doesn't make sense to display one user in a table. What we display in the table is, for example, a user group, which is just a collection of users. Then the element shown in the table would be a user again. So let me show you that. Actually, I will quickly show how to create such a table. So I right-click, I select Table Control. Now I need to specify where the data is coming from. And in my case, this is coming from the list of users, because I show a table of users, and there's one reference showing or representing this list. And I click on Finish. Currently my table is empty because I didn't specify any columns. The good thing is that EMF Forms can derive the columns from the data model again. So if I click Generate Columns, it just adds all the columns following all the attributes of a user. And now I can maybe remove a few of them because there are so many. Maybe like this. And now let's show this, and now I have a working table down here. And I can add elements, I have cell editors where I can enter stuff. So basically I have a working table. Now, this table down here, that's, oh sorry, one feature before, sorry I got confused. One thing that we got frequently as a feature request is to influence the width of those table headers. That's possible. You can actually specify a weight for every column, and that will influence the default rendering. So let me do that. I add a width configuration for, let's say, first name, and I just increase the weight over here, say to 200, like this. And now the first column is bigger. As you might recognize, the table that we use down here is the standard SWT table, which is standard. It doesn't have a very big feature set, so to say. So, and the most important thing that is typically missing is it doesn't allow to select a single cell, which is really bad if you really want to work with this table because you cannot copy paste well. So EMF Forms provides an alternative renderer for the table, and I can actually activate that. Oh, sorry. And now you see the table looks differently. Under the hoods, I have exchanged completely the technology in which the table is rendered. Now this is a Nebula grid table, and this table supports single cell selection, and it also, for example, supports copy paste. Let me quickly start that in the demo application because I wanted to show something related to tables. I've now just changed the form of my demo application to show the table instead. And actually I need to add this. Okay, so now I have embedded the table into my running application. Now, one interesting thing is that the validation that I've shown before, as it is in the model, it can also be used by the table. So if I, for example, now copy the string Maximilian and try to paste it into the email field, it picks up the same validation. Now it shows me a very generic message, which I can, of course, adapt. But as you can see, without me re-specifying those constraints, they're also available in the table. And the same is true for for the cell editor, so I cannot enter any legal values here. Again, we have this loose validation and strict pattern. Okay. Tree master detail. That's an element if you want to allow the user to not only modify one data object, but a collection of data objects, and you want to show them in a hierarchy. EMF Forms has support for that too. So let me demonstrate that without further explanation. So in my example application, currently I embed a form, which can be seen here. So that's the method currently creating the UI. And what I actually do instead now, I call the API of EMF Forms. It provides a tree master detail factory. And with this factory, I can produce a ready to be used tree master detail view, as you will see in a second. I have to pass the parent composite as a parameter and the object that I want to render. So let's restart the application. So now I have a tree. So it's not really a tree because I only have a list of users, but if I would have a hierarchy, there would be a tree. And now if I click something here, we see it on the right side. And here we have the same UI we specified before. Now you might notice if I change between those objects that there is a slight delay, because it actually has to rebuild the form every time. And if you really have users entering a lot of data, users care about this and they hate it, especially if they want to compare two entities with each other. Now, obviously the solution in the manual implementation would be to cache this on the right side and just to refill it with the input. We can do the same with EMF Forms. This tree master detail factory that I've shown before provides support for a cache. So what I can do is I can, to this tree master detail, call set cache, and EMF Forms provides a default implementation of such a cache. This default implementation will cache a view once it has been rendered once, and if we open the same element type again, it will just refill the input. So now when I click here first time, we see this small delay, but if I now just switch, we don't see any delay anymore, because now the form is just refilled. Okay, I think I'm running out of time. Now the final question is, what do you do if you even require another feature where there's no support? And the answer to that is, it is open source. And it's actually, for many things, it's very trivial to fix things. You always have two ways to do that. Either you can talk to us and sponsor a fix, but you can also do it yourself. It's an open project, and we welcome any contributions. And if you're missing a certain feature, feel free to contact us and to contribute that. Typically, the best first step, if you're missing something, is to report a bug, because we might even tell you, okay, it's not missing, but you can do it like this. But if it's really missing, as mentioned, there are two ways you can either contribute, or if you don't want to do that yourself, sponsor the development. How much time do I have left?
2 minutes.
Okay. Now, last thing that I want to mention, technology-wise, is there is a web version of EMF Forms 2 called JSON Forms. We see a screenshot here. It's providing not all features of EMF Forms yet, but the most important ones, and we're actively developing on that. Now, the cool thing is if you use, for example, the constraints definition in model and those rules that I've shown you and the table definition and all this stuff, you don't write a lot of SWT code, and that means if you want to ever migrate to another UI technology, for example, a web stack, you can basically reuse all the stuff. We just need to exchange the renderer. I would like to mention that there is above today in the evening at 6:30. That's basically an informal meeting of the project leads of EMF Forms and a couple of other projects and anyone who's interested in that. So we will just sit there, you can ask questions, you can discuss things, you can shout at us, you can hate us, you can thank us, whatever you want to do. We will be there. So feel free to join if you have any more questions, and besides that, ask me. We have a booth where there's typically one of the committers of EMF Forms, so just feel free to ask any kind of question. And before I close, is there any question right now? Too many features. Okay, then finally, please, if you like the session, think about evaluating that. And if you didn't like it, please forget about it. So, thanks for attending and have a nice remaining conference.